Good. All right. So,
okay, it's already recording. So let's just introduce you, please. Okay. Many thanks, Professor Pillay, Professor Eva, to accept our invitation. Our students are really happy to receive you in Unesp, Franca, even using the Google Meet, and unfortunately not in our school. And the idea of this subject is to analyzing what is happening with our social state in Brazil, in this paradoxical situation of a destructive process of our 1988 constitution by President Bolsonaro, and the pandemic that requires public policies to respond not just to the health questions, but also social and economic demand of our people. And we've invited you because it have a comparative perspective with South Africa, India, and also UK. It will be really interesting for us. So many thanks for accept our invitation. And please, you have the word.
Thank you. That's great. I just want to warn everyone that during the slide presentation, I can't actually see you. So if you need to get my attention, you're going to have to do that by speaking. I am going to leave time for questions at the end, of course. I'm hoping the presentation itself won't take too long. So let me start very briefly by saying a few things about me, only because they're relevant for the presentation. So I'm going to be talking to you about realizing economic and social rights in South Africa. So you'll know that I currently work at Durham University. But before I came to the UK, I studied in South Africa and grew up in South Africa, and then worked at the University of Cape Town for about 10 years. And I started my career as a law academic just when the South Africa's final constitution came into being. So all of that looms large in my life, you know, having been there through that process, and I think has probably informed a lot of my work. And as you'll see as we go on, in recent years, I've also done a bit of work comparing South Africa's approach to economic and social rights to India's, and I'm going to talk about that a bit later. So the pictures on this front slide, well, that's just the South African flag at the top, but at the bottom is a picture of the South African Constitutional Court in session, and I will be talking about that court a little bit. All right, so the outline of my presentation then, just a picture of the South African Constitution to the right. I'm going to talk quickly about the historical background, and then I want to speak about transformative constitutionalism a little bit. I think you'll be talking about this possibly in more detail tomorrow with Sanelli. And then I'm going to look at the economic and social rights provisions that we have in the Constitution, and then how those rights have been interpreted. What is the adjudication model? And then I want to talk about the effectiveness of the approach and key challenges going forward. All right, so a little bit about the historic background then. I think the key thing is that you know, a lot of people may have a question about how we came to protect economic and social rights, rights to healthcare, water, social security, food, etc., in the Constitution. And the historical background has a lot to do with that. So for Black people in South Africa, the system of apartheid deprived them not only of typical civil and political freedoms, such as dignity, liberty, access to justice, it also entailed systematic socioeconomic exploitation. So including things like a lack of access to land, to education, to jobs, services, etc. And so a focus on socioeconomic rights and socioeconomic freedoms and equalities was there from the very early days of the national liberation movement. And you can see that in the African National Congress's Freedom Charter of 1955. So this was drafted on the basis of freedom demands collected from people across the country by 50,000 African National Congress volunteers. And they included obvious civil and political rights, such as the people shall govern, there shall be equal rights, but they also included this demand for houses, security, and comfort. And on this slide, I don't know how much people know about apartheid in South Africa. I think it's always useful to have a visual. And this is, this speaks to the laws that were in place at the time. So if you look at this, this bench, you have a classification there saying Europeans only can sit on the bench. So either the man sitting on the bench at that time committing an illegal act, or the non is missing from this, or is not visible on this picture. This is a picture of a beach in Durham, and this is where I grew up. And this is a beach that was reserved for white people. And when you can have a look at that slide, at that sign more closely, you will see that reference to the law there. All right, so we're jumping ahead a few decades now to talk about the transition to democracy. The process involved very protracted negotiations leading to the first democratic election, and that election took place 26th to 29th of April 1994. Before the election took place, an interim constitution was also drafted. So this was a constitution drafted by a multi-party negotiating forum. This wasn't an elected body yet. This was essentially the agreement put into place by the outgoing government, the incoming African National Congress, and other stakeholders. And the idea was that the interim constitution would be there, but then once the election happened, the democratically elected body would draft a democratic constitution, but respecting certain principles from that interim constitution. And that is a picture of South Africans going to vote in a democratic election for the first time. It's a very evocative picture because, as you can see, that sort of snake of a queue, people at a very hot period, people queued for hours and hours in the sun to be able to exercise that right. All right, so what about economic and social rights then? How did they come to be in the Constitution? I've given you there one of my favorite quotes from an article in 1992. So this was at the time where this debate was happening. And it expresses the idea that a constitution containing only civil and political rights projects an image of truncated humanity, of limited humanity. It brutally excludes those segments of society for whom autonomy means little without the necessities of life. Now, having said that, there was still a debate over the justiciability of economic and social rights in South Africa, as all over the world. And largely that debate centered around two issues. The one was, did courts have the kind of expertise that was needed to pronounce on these rights? If they made a finding that somebody was entitled to dialysis treatment, for instance, would they understand, would they have knowledge of the impact of that on the rest of the health budget or on other socioeconomic issues? The other issue, of course, is that judges are not democratically elected. And in a traditional idea of separation of powers, although courts do have oversight responsibilities, the duty of policy making rests elsewhere. So lawmaking and policy making rests with the legislature and the executive respectively. Now, alongside that, or the argument on the other side, was one about transformative constitutionalism. As I said, you're going to talk more about this tomorrow. This idea was very prominent at the time. the idea that this was a constitution that was not in place to preserve the status quo, but that was intended to put into effect a transformation, a socio-economic transformation of South African society. And then finally, I just wanted to mention the public participation program. So as I said to you just now, once the election had taken place and a democratically elected constitutional assembly came into being, that body began the process of drafting the final constitution. In doing that, they engaged with people's opinions. So there was a widespread public participation program where people, I mean, you may have come across this in relation to crowdsourcing constitutions, which is a big thing at the moment with places like Iceland. So in South Africa, this was more of a paper-based sort of process where people physically went and spoke to, people about what they hoped to see in the constitution. And for a lot of people, requests for rights to jobs, houses, and education were the most important thing. So I'm presenting this just to give you an insight into how we ended up with these economic and social rights in the Constitution, but also to emphasize that it was not uncontroversial. So what are these key provisions? Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time reading these out. I've selected the two most important ones. So this is the provision in the Constitution that deals with the right of access to adequate housing. This is an important qualification. So in subsection 2, you see these provisions or these qualifications taken from international human rights law or based on the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. The state must take reasonable legislative and other measures within its available resources to achieve the progressive realization of this right, okay? In other words, these rights were not being treated exactly the same as civil and political rights. Yes, they were justiciable, but things like available resources had to be taken into account. These rights could be progressively realized. They didn't have to be immediately realized. And then subsection 3 talks about eviction. So this is a right of a more immediate impact. The idea that no one can be evicted from their home without an order of court. We'll talk about evictions a little bit later. This is the other provision that I wanted to talk to you about. Everyone has the right to have access to healthcare services, including reproductive healthcare, sufficient food and water, and social security. Exactly the same qualification as is contained in section 26. And then again, a negatively framed right that is capable of being implemented immediately. No one should be refused emergency medical treatment. So those were the basic provisions, but how did the Constitutional Court approach its duty to give effect to the rights? The court based its approach on this idea of reasonableness. Okay, it's not going to set anybody's world on fire, right? A very lawyerly term. The court's duty is to decide on whether governmental action or inaction is reasonable. In other words, the question is not whether this was the best policy or the most effective policy, but simply whether it was a reasonableness response. And for some people, that was quite disappointing. It felt a bit weak, a bit process-oriented. But then we need to look at the cases. And one of the earliest cases that was decided was the Grootboom case, which has made its way around the world now. Lots of references to the Grootboom decision. And that is a picture of Mrs. Grootboom, the plaintiff in this case, the applicant in this case. So that it was a housing case. And this is where the court first said, we're going to base our model on this idea of reasonableness. In terms of the actual finding in the case, it held that government's policy was in fact unreasonable because it did not provide for those in desperate needs, those with no access to land, no roof over their heads, people who are living in intolerable conditions, people who are in a crisis. So by the nature of the facts, this wasn't going to have a widespread impact, or what you could see was the court wasn't necessarily treading on governmental toes too much. And that's partly because the case was quite limited. It was about emergency housing. But it was also because by the time the case came to the Constitutional Court, government had already reached an agreement. They'd already, with the applicants in this case. So essentially what the court was doing was issuing a declaratory order. It was simply declaring that the policy as it stood was unreasonable because it didn't have provision for those in crisis. The Treatment Action Campaign case was a much more interesting case in a way. It went further. So still using a reasonableness model, but here you had the context of a government that was very resistant to the court pronouncing on this issue. So Treatment Action Campaign dealt with HIV treatment, specifically the use of nevirapine to prevent mother-to-child transmission of HIV. And government policy at the time was that this was restricted to certain pilot sites, and the case was brought to try to extend that. All right. Now, some of you may know that government had a frankly bizarre policy on HIV at the time. The president, Thabo Mbeki, did not believe that, he was an AIDS denialist. He didn't believe that HIV caused AIDS. The health minister was recommending treatments including, I think it was beetroot, sweet potato, something like that. So a resistance to providing antiretroviral drugs. And it was in light of that background that the that the Constitutional Court handed down quite a wide-ranging order. So this was a mandatory order, so essentially setting out, declaring government's policy to be unreasonable, but then also setting out what it had to do to make its policy reasonable, okay? And there is still some critique of the case because the government, the court, again, declined to set out a minimum core content of the right to health. So in these early cases, you had lawyers essentially trying to push the court to say, this is the minimum content of housing. This is the minimum content of healthcare. And the court was not prepared to do that. It stopped short of that, indicating that this was something that that the executive should be doing. The court also refused to put in place a structural interdict or supervisory jurisdiction. So the applicants, or by this stage appellants, wanted the court to say, we will now supervise the implementation of our order. So government needs to come back to us and show us how they are implementing our order. And the court was cautious about that. They didn't want to go that far. I should note that the supervisory jurisdiction is something the Constitutional Court has used in later cases. There's a third case mentioned on the slide. I'm not going to talk much about that because I need to move on, but this dealt with extending Social Security benefits to permanent residents. So not just to citizens of the country, but to permanent residents. And again, the court found the government's policy was unreasonable and it had to extend these benefits. Okay, so now we come on to some of the later cases. And a lot of my recent work is focused on this idea of meaningful engagement, so a managerial role for the courts. So this is it's not quite a departure from reasonableness. So the court is still working in that rubric of reasonableness. But what you had was suddenly court saying, all right, we think this idea of meaningful engagement is very important. So this is an idea informed by the value of participatory democracy, and it was first developed in an evictions case. So this was a case where the court halted proceedings and ordered that the city of Johannesburg engage meaningfully with about 400 people it wished to evict from unsafe and unhygienic buildings. In other words, the court said, hang on, you've not consulted with these people that you are trying to evict. So we're going to stop proceedings. You need to go and do that. You need to meaningfully engage with this group of people, and we will not allow for eviction until you have done that. So in this process of meaningful engagement, the parties, the people who were being evicted, and the city of Johannesburg, all acting in good faith, managed to carve out an agreement that both sides were roughly happy with, a mutually satisfactory agreement, which they then took back to the court. So what do we think about meaningful engagement? Well, that's really up to you. On the slide, I've mentioned some possible strengths, so you can see where the court is coming from. This is an approach that enhances the democratic legitimacy of judicial decision-making. So it's not the court saying, this is what you are going to do. It's the court saying, well, you need to engage with the people who are affected and come to some kind of agreement. So it bypasses the criticism that the court is overstepping the boundaries of its role and of its expertise. And so, sorry, that is the second point, that it helps to overcome those concerns. And arguably that this is empowering. Rather than seeing people as victims, it sees people as active participants in policy making on issues that affect them. And then the critiques are that this is yet again a process-oriented method of dealing with the rights. Instead of looking at the substantive content of the rights, which is what judges will typically do in any civil and political rights case, it is focusing on the process. And because of that, it is a weak approach. So that kind of criticism has typically come from South Africans who essentially hoped that the court would take a more robust approach to the rights. All right. So even if we see Olivia Road as a positive example, a positive use of meaningful engagement, and I do think it was, there is a question about what happened afterwards. And so we do see in the later cases, it's possible to argue that there's been a dilution of reasonableness and of meaningful engagement. So just starting with the picture to your right there on the Joe Slovo housing case. So this was a case, 2009. So this was just South Africa was going to host the World Cup, the Football World Cup in 2010. And any of you who've been to South Africa may notice that when you drive from the airport to the center of town, you pass quite a lot of informal housing settlements known in South Africa as squatter settlements. And this is something the government wasn't too happy about, this idea of all our tourists coming in for the World Cup and seeing this on their way into the beautiful city center. So there was quite a rush to try and get this to upgrade the informal housing settlement there. And this was part of a bigger national project to eradicate informal housing and provide low-cost houses. So laudable objectives, praiseworthy objectives here, but the questions were around how the government was going about this. And so people in that settlement were arguing that they wanted the housing to be upgraded whilst they remained on site. They didn't want to be moved because they objected to the area being far away from their jobs. They wouldn't be able to get to work. And this area called Delft was quite unsafe. There were reports of it being unsafe. So that was one of the key issues in the case. The reason that it's an important part of this presentation is because it was quite clear that government had not engaged meaningfully. It was a very top-down process where people were just informed, okay? They were not consulted in any meaningful sense about what was going to happen. Despite this, the Constitutional Court found government's policy, their approach, to be reasonable, all right? So it wasn't like Olivia Road where they halted the eviction. They allowed for the eviction to go on, despite acknowledging that there have been problems with engagement. But they also held that engagement must continue. And in the process of that further engagement, it became clear to government that they could not move people off the land. They couldn't actually afford, they didn't have enough land to move people on. So in other words, they agreed. They capitulated to the demand of on-site upgrading, all right? Mazibuko is similar in a way. So if this was a water rights case, and briefly the facts were that for people in the townships, they had access to a prepaid meter, and there's a picture of one there. And that delivered a certain amount of water per month, so 25 liters per person per month. Once that amount of water was finished, the supply was cut off. And people relying on that prepaid meter could not have any more access until they were able to pay for more. And so the case was about that approach, and it was also about the amount of water. So 25 liters per person per day, particularly when you're dealing with waterborne sanitation, flushing toilets, etc., is not enough. All right. The World Health Organization that has indicated that it's not enough, that there will be health problems as a result of that. And so the court was asked in that case to set out what would be a reasonable amount of water. It refused to do that. It simply said that government's policy was reasonable. And it adopted a very deferential approach. So in terms of how it defined reasonableness, if you look at the judgment, you can see almost a thinning of the idea of reasonableness. Again, however, the government gave in to the 50 liters per day request or demand by people that were affected. And that was because of further engagement, but also because of protests and because of illegal connection to the water supply. Okay, so people, this is how they dealt with the problem of not having any water, is that they connected illegally to the supply. And this campaign was supported by a number of civil society organizations. All right. So some Indian comparisons then. Quick thing to note, these rights to healthcare, etc., economic and social rights are not directly justiciable in the Indian constitution. They are contained in a non-justiciable section called Directive Principles of State Policy. Now, despite that, the Indian Supreme Court has historically been quite activist, not consistently so, but it has been so. And so it introduced, or a group of judges introduced, this idea of public interest litigation, which was there to essentially allow for greater access to courts. So in terms of how people petition the court, public interest litigation makes that easier. So the court would accept a letter from somebody as a petition, as the beginning of a case. As part of this wider movement, the court began to interpret the right to life to include things that were mentioned in the Directive Principles of State Policy. So a right to life includes access to shelter. It includes food, right to food, etc. And the case study that I want to very quickly talk about is the right to food. So one of the pieces that I gave you contains information about this. The 2001 drought in India left large numbers of people facing starvation in the knowledge that government was allowing excess grain stocks to rot. This galvanized disparate groups and individuals into a full-fledged right to food campaign. One of the more successful aspects of the right to food campaign is the midday meal scheme. But the main reason for that is that it has been championed outside the courts through lively campaigns. All right. So when we see the right to food case study as a success story, it's important to also acknowledge that the organization that brought the case has had to repeatedly go back to court to try to get government to comply with the order. The court order remains open, so it's easy for them to go back to court. There's a supervisory jurisdiction in place. But in order to actually get this implemented, it has taken repeated return to the courts and then also campaigning and activism. The story of the treatment action campaign in South Africa is similar. So again, litigation was only one aspect of their strategy. They used a mixture of protest, lobbying, and strategic use of the courts. It's interesting that they, particularly in that early case that I talked about, that they suddenly found themselves in the role of having to become experts on HIV and AIDS because they had to fill in that gap. They had to present the court with the scientific information because the government was not doing that, and they had to contradict the information that government was putting forward. In subsequent years, the Treatment Action Campaign has informed government's HIV policy. So in a sense, has almost been a partner in trying to frame that policy. What do these two examples have in common? You had a well-defined economic and social rights issue. So the HIV treatment, the right to food in India. You had resourceful civil society organization or organizations supporting the particular issue. Relatively few resource constraints. So with the Treatment Action Campaign case in South Africa, the Nevirapine was being provided free of charge for a certain number of years. With the right to food case, the grain stocks were there, they just weren't being distributed. And you had national and international exposure of problematic governmental action. All right, so challenges going forward. One of the key challenges both in South Africa and in India remains corruption. So there are high levels of corruption in both states, and these present a serious obstacle to the aspirations of transformative constitutionalism. You know, and particularly in terms of ensuring material equality, socioeconomic equality. And I've mentioned COVID because COVID really highlights some of these points. So the pandemic is highlighting existing inequalities and problems with service delivery. So this is from a report by Human Rights Watch. The authorities in India also need to recognize that queuing up for services has become a concept that makes little sense in societies where resources are scarce, favoritism and corruption is common, and those who wait can well be left behind. In other words, people don't wait. If you can afford it, you pay bribes and you get oxygen on the black market, etc. All right. The situation is similar in South Africa. There've been, that's a picture of the president of South Africa, Cyril Ramaphosa. There's been theft of food parcels, allocation of contracts for PPE in a corrupt way, fraudulent claims to emergency social security benefits. But then also on the good news front, you have corruption very much in the public eye, and a number of civil society organizations now taking this up as a cause. And the blog post that I gave you has a little bit of information on that. I should make the point that, of course, you know, with COVID, the corruption that we're seeing around allocation of contracts, etc., is not limited to countries like South Africa and India. Of course, we're seeing that in this country as well. But the difference is that here we're talking about countries with existing very serious problems with healthcare and with service delivery. So you have an existing problem that is very serious being exacerbated by a pandemic. A final word then before I close. I often get questions about my focus on the courts. I don't mean to preempt that. I'm happy to answer any questions about that. But I do want to make it clear that what my argument is never that courts should be where the focus is. Rather, I think that certainly in a country like South Africa, where you have one-party dominance over so many years, the courts have played and continue to play an important role. They are elitist institutions, there's no getting around that. But in the particular political dynamic of South Africa, they have been essential to trying to ensure good governance. And I will leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Pillay. I think that now we could listen the lecture from Professor Eva, and then we present our comments and questions could be.
Right.
Both. Okay.
Let's see whether I can pull this. Oops. Sorry. Nope. See, I've not used you.
Yeah.
Why is it blocking me now? No. Right. Allow. Sorry. Got something.
Yes. Yes.
It is working now, Professor.
Pardon?
No, it's stopped. It was working, but not more.
Yeah.
Is it not working now?
No, you close it. Try again.
I'm sharing Firefox, but I don't want to share Firefox. Oops. Do you want to? Okay.
You are presenting the Google meeting, not your presentation.
What? I know. I'm just trying to. Oh, stop presenting this. Marina, do you mind pulling up my presentation? I can't. I don't seem.
Or maybe I could do it if.
Oh, hang on.
can.
Yeah. Can you see my screen now?
No, but I can
you
put
see
your
it now?
presentation.
Okay, something's gone. Let's see. I'm sorry about this. This is not working for me. Okay, I need to come back into the room. I'm sorry, I can't seem to put the.
I can put for you, or Murilo, if you want. What is better?
Yes, if you could, please, Marina.
Yeah, Marina, please.
Also.
Otherwise, it's going to take too much time. I'm sorry about this.
No problem.
Oh, no problem.
Oops, hang on. I seem to be. Okay, so is this my screen or Marina's screen now? Because I can see it on mine.
It is yours.
It's yours.
Oh, it's mine. Okay.
Now. Perfect.
Right, brilliant. it's worked now. Thank you very much. So, oops. Right. Okay. I think, yeah, I'm a bit like Anashri. I'm sort of not able to see you, but I think you can all see me and I think you can hear me. So I'm just going to, oops. I'm just slightly nervous of, okay, I'm just going to keep it like this. I'm a bit worried it's going to block again. So I'm just going to keep this in this non-professional way just to be on the safe side. So welcome everybody, even though I cannot see you. And my name is Eva-Maria Nag. I'm also from Durham University, as you can see from my PowerPoint slides, the School of Government and International Affairs. So my focus is going to be slightly on more on the political dimensions of the state and social welfare, with the focus on India. I'm also by training a political theorist. I've worked on Indian political theory in the main. And I have to say that one of the key texts in Indian political thinking of modern times, pre-independence and post-independence, have been the constitutional debates and indeed the Indian constitution. So I am very much looking forward to a little chat on Brazil, India, and South Africa at the end of this, because I think it'll be important to, get some comparisons off the road, as Anashri has already started doing. So this is really quite interesting. So one of the things I want to just start with, and I hope I'm not being rude about just giving you some basic information about India, but I'm just going to assume that apart from us being, say, lumped together often in the international community as the BRICS, that we don't that there's more to it from our side, from the Indian side. So what I want to consider is India's standalone case in this respect, so it makes comparison easier. I hope we can get some insights about the links between democracy and welfare by looking at India a little bit. I hope we can also compare and contrast case studies such as Brazil and South Africa and India. And perhaps we can also find some general points that together help us think further about realizing economic and social rights, especially in countries that are so-called developing. Now, if you're looking at this image, it's more about honing in on the fact that India remains an agrarian country, and that it is, that it is. While it is urbanizing, it's important to remember that most of the population work in the informal agrarian sector. And so there is a real strong element of precarity still in the Indian political system that needs to be dealt with. So Many of you will have a sense of India in the way it's often described by the media, but also increasingly in sort of academic circles, as post-colonial state, as a developmental state, as an emerging economy, and as the world's largest democracy. Of course, right now, that is in doubt in some respects. But what we can say, though, is that India's democracy has remained remarkably resilient in the face of multiple challenges. And some of these challenges are that it is the societies, and I say intentionally in the plural, Indian societies are hierarchical, as I mentioned, agrarian. They are rapidly urbanizing as well, bringing with it its own challenges, such as we see in the case of China, with realizing socioeconomic rights in urbanizing contexts is quite difficult. And it has it's highly unequal. It's multinational, highly pluralist. It is multi-religious as well, although it has a strong Hindu majority, of course. At the same time, the country, as Anashri has also spoken about, has a constitutional government, a strong Supreme Court. It has a federal system of government comprising state-center relations that are quite contested. So I myself stem from the state of West Bengal that has just, in the recent state elections, rejected Modi's BJP. And so we can say regular elections are held. So since 2014, the dominant political party has been the BJP. And it straddles very different platforms, so it means different things to different people. It straddles the agendas of economic growth and liberalization. It also espouses social conservatism based on so-called Hindu values. And it has pushed for a rolling back of a lot of affirmative action policies and the recognition of religious minorities in particular, and that of so-called backward castes. So for many observers, both academic and non-academic, these developments constitute serious challenges to India's republican and also secular credentials as a post-colonial state. Now, others point to further challenges. Anashri has mentioned corruption. There's also the rise of personal political rule, the politicization of the bureaucracy, and the increasing power of the center. So turning to a narrow focus that we're interested here in this, how do we think about welfare in the Indian context? So can one even talk about India as a welfare state? Now, most commentators would argue yes, and that is based on the constitution, even though, as Anashri has pointed out, these are not sort of directly realizable aims. Nonetheless, Article 38 of India's constitution, and this is from 1950, and it was not contested, by the way, in the constitutional debates, which is quite interesting. So it went through straight away. Article 38 states that the state is to secure a social order for the promotion of welfare of the people. So here it is, if you can see it. And in full, the state shall strive to promote the welfare of the people by securing and protecting as effectively as it may a social order in which justice, so social, economic, and political, shall inform all the institutions of the national life. So these are norms. So it's not yet realized yet, of course. Interestingly enough, the state shall, in particular, strive to minimize the inequalities in income and endeavor to eliminate inequalities in status, facilities, and opportunities, not only amongst individuals, but also amongst groups. I'm stressing this a little bit now, of people residing in different areas or engaged in different vocations. So other elements of India's twist on welfarism, the focus on groups, is really something important, and we might want to discuss that a little bit. Other elements derive from India's anti-colonial thinking that in part claimed its legitimacy based on recognizing cultural rights. So these were all seen to be intrinsic to socioeconomic rights, that they could not be separated. And also based on ancient and often reinvented, clearly, traditions of justice. So broadly speaking, Indian political thinking and also commentaries on the constitution take into account that specifically to India, unlike say in Western states, rights and obligations are directly intertwined, and that duties matter. So, in other words, rights bearers are also duty bearers as a condition of their rights. And that's slightly different to rights bearers having duties accorded to them. The case of India is very interesting because rights and duties are seen to coincide. And that poses, of course, questions for political agency and action. So with regard to justice, many of you will have heard of the Indian thinker Amartya Sen. Now, he points to an important distinction made in ancient Hindu texts, and one that continues to play out, whether in India or elsewhere, and that is the distinction between niti and nyaya. So niti is about rules. In India, it is about organizational propriety and behavioral correctness. Nyaya refers to the concept of realized justice in society. Now, for Sen, neither concept on its own can be the route to justice, to social justice. So in other words, social, state, and market structures matter as much as choices matter about institutions and behaviors. So structures and choices for him have to come together. So justice is something that is always in the making, and welfare, therefore, is always in the making. And I think this is something worth reflecting on. So I will now turn to the nature of India's politics that provide the basis for some of these choices that can be made regarding welfare. And I'm using welfare as a sort of shortcut for socioeconomic rights. To reiterate, India is a very dynamic polity. At the moment, it is oriented both outwards and inwards towards preserving the state and towards claiming its status as an international player, or at least of pan-regional influence, and that really matters. So the three master concepts, or I would call them master concepts, or guiding principles of post-colonial India that play into the politics of welfare and justice. And one is sovereignty, and the second, development, and third, democracy. So those are these watchwords that we can sort of use to think about the Indian case study. Sovereignty matters hugely to the development of the Indian state. It relates to securing external borders, but also to securing internal order, especially in a pluralist society like India. This has been one of the biggest challenges that the post-colonial state faced. Now, development relates, unsurprisingly, to domestic economic growth and inclusion within the international economic order. In India's case, democracy relates to the state's recognition of individual and groups' rights to self-determination, and as well as it's taking into account its histories of proto-democracy that we do find in the Indian case. It also relates more informally to access to resources, networks, and means of redistribution. So these ideals are often pursued through the means of state violence. And I'd sent you the text I'd written on Indian theories of state violence, just as a sort of, snapshot of where things are. And in that, I described how state violence in India ranges from direct and physical oppression to newer forms of legal violence and bureaucratic violence like red tape. So this is a big problem with regard to realizing these constitutional norms of justice and redressing inequalities. But while part of the problem is securing state control over resources in order to maintain sovereignty and in order to develop economic power, the developmental state of India is also under increasing pressure, and has been for a long time, from old and new groups, social groups, and their sets of demands to benefit from growth and development. So there's a lot of activism going on, again, something that Anashri also highlighted. I would like to notice at this point, there's a bit of a caveat here, that the modern Indian state, and indeed most parts of its society have yet themselves to decolonize, I think. In other words, to critically reflect on their priorities that sometimes are still a hallmark of modern Europeanized ways of thinking. And it'll be interesting to see how many of the BRICS countries go forward in taking new agendas forward that's very much their agenda, or whether there's still going to be a huge need to play catch up. So-called. So what I'd like to also highlight in this case is when it comes to welfare provision, the pressures on so the state has its own pressures and its own forms of violence, but the pressures faced by the state are also played out at the societal level. And in democracies, like in India, these societies stand for agency and voice. And agency and voice can take several shapes. So they can take the shape of checks and balances, of competition, of compromise, and of competition. And this really matters towards welfare provision. So competition happens at various levels. And this is, by the way, clearly not just in India. The first is an intra-elite competition for resources. So what we see in terms of political sociology in India is that political elites, social elites, economic elites, and bureaucratic elites do not necessarily overlap, nor do their interests. So there's a lot going on there that needs to be observed. We also see non-elite competition, and this is really for resources, for resources like subsidies, direct cash transfers, employment measures, health and education funding, and also for formal recognition as vulnerable groups that doesn't in the end matter to get some of these transfers. And we also see elite, non-elite competition for resources. So how do we view and evaluate these continuous changes and competitive strivings in India's state society and intra-society relations? So on the one hand, we can view democracy as a hindrance to realizing India's constitutional aims of providing justice and welfare, if we agree with the premise that democracies reproduce socioeconomic systems of private property and wealth acquisition. So that's an argument you will be familiar with. We may also take a more optimistic but a much more modest view that democracy in India is unlikely to lead to radical transformations, but that the effect of constant, even if uneven, pressure on the state by part of India's non-elite societies might serve to keep nudging the state to not drop the ball completely with regard to realizing welfarist norms and aspirations. So as current data on global inequality shows, the creation of greater wealth and development does not automatically lead to greater access to the pie by all. So I think a lot of us have come away from this idea that trickle down somehow works. So democracy matters in that this access has to be argued for and competed for, and democracy affords that platform. So finally, the question has to be asked whether this is indeed happening. What are we actually seeing? So to look at social security in India, just briefly, it covers 7 key areas, and these are covered by the policy directive. So healthcare, old age, family and childcare, accidents, occupational disease, and very importantly, rural job guarantees. This is a highly politicized area of action, and food security. So now, where do we stand now? As of 2020, the Indian government's expenditure on social security was about $220 billion US, and that's about 7.3% of India's GDP. To give you a comparison with the so-called developed countries, in 2019, the EU average was 19.3% of GDP was spent. But it is worth noting that the range, even in Europe, is quite wide. So it ranges between 24% of spending of GDP in Finland to a very low 8.9% in Ireland. So India is actually not, it's not a complete outlier on that front. But of course, we're looking at different levels of existing wealth. But it's just in terms of percentage-wise and share of the pie, much has to be done, but not completely outside of the pale. So Unfortunately, there hasn't been much movement from the period of 2014 to 2019. Of the total GDP expenditure, there was an increase of about 1.5 percentage points during this period to be spent on social welfare. So that's not huge. And what the Corona budget of 2021-22 shows, it's actually a bit worrying. The budget signals falls in spending on rural employment and development, falls in spending on women and children, and some rises, but only marginal rises for education and health and social welfare. So not huge amounts of improvement in greater allocation. But this is what I want to come from. So I want to come at in the article I sent on Deval Desai and Shalini Randeria, whether this is indeed only about allocation. And of course, you know, the argument is, it could be very basic to say, of course not, but I mean, we've got a case study here to look at. So during last year, in 2020, the government released Corona emergency funds that totaled $22.6 billion, which is a massive, that's about total social welfare spending for one of the previous years. Having said that, what's interesting is that 4.2 billion and 4.7 billion respectively came from unspent social special purpose funds, one from funds for construction workers that were being hauled in by the government through cess taxes since 1996, I'm afraid, I think. And the other came from District Mineral Foundation funds, and that's for miners, funds for miners, also the precariat, and to some extent, that were also unspent since 2014. So I should note that the construction workers, that's India's second largest informal sector. And so India's got about 56 million workers in construction out of a total workforce of 500 million. So what does it mean? Does it mean that we have the structures, but we're not, how are we getting to that Nyaya stage? How are we realizing it? Now, Desai and Randeria make three arguments effectively. One, they say that public-private models, when it comes to allocation of funding and collection of taxes, that then turn into trusts, are not the best vehicles for spending collected funds because they cannot be fully held accountable as part of government spending. So here the lesson learned is really about appropriate institutional arrangements that enable action and accountability. So accountability needs to be factored in to these policies. Second, they mention the problem of institutional hybridity, and I agree with their reading in that this kind of hybridity resists political pressure because people are not sure who to then access, especially when those who are directly affected belong to the vulnerable groups. And third, they mention the blurring of the interests of special and recognized groups and that of the general interest. And the problem here is, this is a problem of democracy, of course, that interests are also political capital to be drawn on by political elites in future times as well, rather than always responding to immediate needs. So here what we see are that the problems are both about choices, the choice to take political action or not take action, and about structures that are ambiguous in their design and inefficient in their delivery. So how can welfare or justice as Nyaya be achieved, the realization? So changes will most likely have to come from constant voice and pressure, but also through somewhat detailed and painstaking work of policy planning, implementation, and evaluation through the various stages. So we've got a lot of technocratic solutions out there. There's lots of reports at the moment coming out what can be done about India's vulnerable segments of the population through also as a result of COVID. But something I do want to stress is that what can democracy offer is also a platform for playing out some of the tensions that will always be there. So we're not going to just be able to have a technocratic solution to some of these issues, because in a democracy, we will have perennial tensions, and I'm just going to list 4. One is self-determination and representation of the interests of the vulnerable versus the problem of paternalism and domination. The second, of course, in any electoral democracy, we've got a tension between immediate versus long-term interests. We also have to think about how economic growth is achieved. In India, as in many other countries, it is elite-driven economic growth. But then there's always going to be demands for redistribution that need to be taken into account, and how does this play out politically? And in the case of India, of course, there's a very big question about India's pluralism versus the solidarity that is often needed for de facto redistributive measures. So for now, democracy in India looks to yield small and modest results, not wholesale changes. However, I do think, say for instance, the current discourse in climate change shows that voices and interests, even though they may be diverse, at times can coincide. So we're trying to find tipping points now as to when is economic and social justice, when are there tipping points? I don't think we've reached there yet. So my instincts are that these democratic agreements will have to be found on multiple platforms and in multiple ways, rather than by the endorsement of uniform rights-based approaches to welfare and justice alone. So I'm going to stop sharing here and look forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Eva. I will do some comments and 2 questions. And then I would like to listen to you again, Pillay and Eva, and I would invite the students during it to stand up the hand of the Google Meet to ask the word to make your comments and questions. First, it's really interesting to listen to you because we are also a post-colonial country, and we use it just to listen the central countries here. We used to invite the European discussion. You both work in a European university, but we both come from post-colonial countries and are studying this perspective. So it's really interesting for us to know more about India and South Africa in Brazil from someone like you that really knows it really deeply. And there are 2 countries important for the commercial and political relations, especially because of BRICS, but not just it. And there are excellent cases for comparative studies. First, when you talked about the transformative constitutionalism, Pillay, I remember a Portuguese juridical theorist named Canutilho. I don't know if you have listened about him, that wrote about what's called in Portuguese Constituição Dirigente, or something like dirigent constitutionalism. I don't know if everybody will agree with me, but I think that it has a very similar approach about how a constitution could change some reality. And it has inspired the constitution, the Portuguese constitution, and also the Brazilian one. Then when we talked about the justability of economic and social rights, we have the same debate in Brazil. We don't use it to question anymore if it's legitimate or not to the Supreme Court, the judicial power, to try to implement social and economic rights. But if they are or not able to do it, if they have the necessary expertise to do it, it's also important question for us. And there is an interesting experiment related to it, which we could call institutional dialogue, when executive power and judicial power start to dialogue and invite experts to inform the judicial power decision. I really like the case that you present, Pillay, about the combination of litigation and social mobilization as a strategy. Because if the social movement just litigate, I think that it will depolitize the conflict, it will depolitize the demand, and will lose the potential to transform the reality. Listen, Eva, I think that the Indian democracy is not just larger than the Brazilian one, but much more complex than ours because of the plurality of the society and the border questions. That's something that you highlighted in the paper that you share with us. We don't have important border questions in border issues in Brazil. You talk about corruption. It's also something important for us. It's not necessary to say. But, and this is my question, I've not listened, you speaking so much about inequality. You have spoken about it, but I would like to listen a little bit more, because I have serious doubts about the capacity of our dirigent constitutional or any transformative constitutional to change the structural inequality of the Brazilian society. And I also have, unfortunately, doubt about the capacity of our democracy to change this structural inequality of our society. And I think that Eva talked a little, talked about this also in India. So I'd like to listen you both a little more about inequality, because it's another similar between our countries. And it was not exactly the purpose of your lectures, but as you live in UK, I would like to listen to you about how UK is managing this crisis as a developed country, and have a social state that inspires us also. The Brazilian health system is directly inspired by NHS, and maybe it's more universal than NHS also, but not work so well. So these are my questions, and if you could comment, please, and then we will listen to the questions of our students. And Marina, many thanks to help us to organize this lecture.
I'm happy to go first, Eva, if that's okay. I mean, lots of things to say there. I'm just going to start with the point that you were making about, I suppose, the relationship between constitutionalism and actually addressing structural inequality. I mean, that's the root of it, isn't it? And it's an issue that I struggle with. You know, in the South African context, I think there was a lot of hope around the idea of transformative constitutionalism in those early days. And I think most people would tell you now that that's transformed into a certain level of cynicism. And I think part of that has to do with law, the way laws work, and constitutionalism is that it's a very limited structure, and the whole system is based on working within that, you know, and there are questions around what that excludes, you know, particularly from a society coming from a very, you know, history of political mobilization, of campaigning, etc., suddenly moving into this idea of, well, here's this constitution that's going to be the silver bullet, and everything that we need to do needs to be funneled through that. And I think, so there's that side of it. And a result of that, a very good result of that, has been the reinvigoration of civil society, if you like. I mean, I don't think that's ever really gone away in South Africa, but I think that has been heightened in recent years as people become more and more disillusioned with the ANC. So that, but then I think it also, it also speaks to the question of how we use something like constitutionalism and the courts by extension. What is their actual role? And I think it is quite a limited one. I think the most successful campaigns, as we were talking about, are ones that approach the courts in a fairly circumspect way. Or the other thing that I just wanted to mention, and I'll stop talking, was, when I talked about this kind of retreat that we saw in South Africa and this frustration with the Constitutional Court, why are you suddenly watering down some very good decisions? The thing about the Treatment Action Campaign case was that there was a serious backlash over that. So there was a way in which Constitutional Court judges, and this is only reportedly, it's not something that a judge is ever going to tell you, but basically had to suddenly toe the line because they had so upset government with their decision in the Treatment Action Campaign case. So there are also very important issues about the institutional security of courts and other institutions within the country and their need to protect that, because if that doesn't exist, then the whole idea of good governance falls apart. And with respect to India, one of the things that always struck me with the Indian Supreme Court is that it's quite patchy. So you get some really quite maverick judgments, judges doing much more than they're allowed to do, or that, a court like the South African Constitutional Court would do. And then you get things at the other end of the spectrum. But then you also get quite a lot of those judgments being ignored, which is not to say you don't have that in South Africa, but I think there's more of that. I don't know if you would agree with that, Eva, but so I think there are concerns around institutional security there, and I'll stop talking now.
Right. Anashri, absolutely, I totally agree with you. I think the Indian case, the Supreme Court judgments, and I follow some of them for non-human rights rulings, very interesting, very forward-looking, incredibly eclectic and well put together, well argued, well researched. And then you've got some crazy stuff on traditions that no one's ever heard of, and that are clearly in the hands of the BJP. So there is also, I think, with regards to judges in India, a real problem of politics coming into the fray a lot more, with more and more appointees being signed off by the ruling party, and that is unfortunately what I think we're seeing a lot. On the other hand, the Supreme Court's done amazing work in the 1990s on women's rights, rights to inherit property, rights to open bank accounts, etc., etc. So yes, I mean, very patchy, but I think a result of the sort of power of the legislative to some extent. So to some extent, India's democracy is overperforming, if one has to say this. You've actually got a highly dynamic system in play that is overheating to some extent, I think. And the Supreme Court used to keep a lid on this, but they're now part of that overheating. On inequality, because I don't want to take up all the time now, Murilo, yeah, absolutely. I'm glad you asked that question. So I think the research on inequality shows us, first of all, that global inequality is widening, right? But also what we see in each and every country, including in OECD countries, such as we're in now, inequalities are widening as well. So it's massive. So everywhere, inequalities are widening. The research is also very clear on the negative impact of inequality on social cohesion and solidarity, right? So highly unequal societies tend to be less solidaristic, but also they tend to do worse on indicators such as health and education, women's rights. I mean, there's all kinds of indicators that unequal societies, have problems with. The second layer of the question is slightly more complicated, which is how much inequality can actually be tolerated. And I think what you see is that the world is tolerating a lot of it. I mean, even India is a case study where people in the 70s, 80s, I mean, I grew up then, there was always that, surely there's got to be a revolution at some point. Surely you can't carry on with the rate of growth of 3% and people starving. And as we see in Corona, people can die and nothing can happen. I mean, let's be clear that the levels of social and individual tolerance is sometimes something that we have to ask ourselves how many of us have got it right or wrong in terms of human nature. I'm not saying universal human nature is like this, but what is it that we can actually tolerate until we reach tipping points? And I think the climate discussion is very interesting, because I don't think it's come from grassroots action only. It has come from when the wealthy are affected, and when it's rich countries like the US, or people here, or French farmers, that's when suddenly you see these interests suddenly blowing up, right? So the only thing that we can do at the grassroots level is to keep the pressure up. And I think to ask for change may be too much, but we can keep the pressure up. When I say we, I count myself as the kind of middle class, whatever, poor. But where I think in India there are, and I just want to end with some sort of theoretical considerations that we see in the Indian case by Indian political scientists, and I tend to be on say people, I tend to follow people like Atul Kohli, who are on the left, but who also argue for a very autonomous role of politics. So in other words, you can have, the Marxist argument would be that inequalities and wealth, they determine and shape politics. Whereas I think there's a very strong argument, especially the case of India is very good for that, to be made to de-link, to decouple the two, and actually say there is an autonomous sphere for politics. And in the Indian case, especially with regard to the constitutional and the constitutional debates pre-independent, at the time of independence especially, what is quite striking is that all the debates very much noted that the role of ideas have to play, and they refer to sort of Indian traditions, and that's something to do with anti-colonialism. In other words, we may be materially oppressed and politically oppressed, but we've got our ideas. And that in post-colonial states can be quite a strong source of strength. That, in other words, that kind of, I don't like the idea of purity of ideas, and they're not, but they were used and instrumentalized to say that this is where we are autonomous. And that notion of ideational autonomy, and therefore the decoupling of, say, economic considerations from political considerations, I think has a strong tradition in some post-colonial states that we can't just deny. And I'll stop here.
Well, very good. I would like to listen to you a little about UK. A small comment, please.
I think Eva spoke about this a little bit, and I forgot to, so I'll come in on this. I mean, the point you've already made is that those inequalities are increasing here as well, and I think I said in my presentation about the corruption inquiries that are going on here. I mean, a lot of the stuff that people are talking about here is the question of how much can the government get away with before people actually respond, So that's something that we're watching. But I think one of the key differences for me is the starting position. So when you start from, a health system that is relatively healthy, I mean, under-resourced, of course, even before Corona, under pressure, austerity measures, etc., but still one that functions very well, or functions pretty well. When you start from that position and then add on this, kind of contracts, PPE contracts being given to cronies and mates and not people actually qualified to do it, then there is harm, but the harmful impact is not as severe as we're seeing in places like South Africa and in India and in Brazil, but obviously I can't speak for Brazil. Marilla, was that your question about the UK?
Yes, it's fine. Many thanks. Now, Marina will present here our question, and another one posted in the chat by Guilherme Gienes. Please, Marina. Marina, seu microfone está desligado. Não. Não está funcionando. Escreva aqui, não estou entendendo nada. Oh, Marina will try to solve the problem. Now I will read, try to translate the Guilherme questions. Guilherme asked if currently the representation of excluded and marginalized groups in India and South Africa occurred better and the best expressive way by the litigation, the judicial system, or by the political system. And if the political system is being able to address and internalize this kind of interest, the interest of the excluded and marginalized social groups. Marina, está funcionando agora?
Oi, vocês estão me ouvindo? Hello.
Sim, agora sim.
Hey.
Enquanto você falava, eu tentei aqui traduzir a pergunta do Guilherme e parece que entenderam. E você vai fazer a sua, aí elas respondem ambas, pode ser?
Yeah. Did you guys got the question that he translated? So, yeah. So, actually, I was going to ask a question, but my audio is not working, but now it is. Professor Pillay probably heard me read my thesis a lot about this. It is about how, at least here in Brazil, the Supreme Court, they are easily to decide on civil and political rights or individual rights, like you say, Professor Eva, about women's rights or LGBT rights, but easier. They are more comfortable than to decide in regards to social and economic rights, for example, and also there is a problem here with the access to justice as well. For example, not only in regards to, you have all the constitutional law that you have here in Brazil, but it is hard for people with low income money to have access to go to these courts. So you have two kinds of inequality: the inequality of money as well, but inequality to assess all the things that institutions have to these kind of things. I spoke a lot with Professor Pillay about this in regards to the will to judge, to want to decide in some cases more about individual rights, for example, LGBT rights, than social and economic rights. And I go to, for example, climate change. Here is a problem because it also has a problem with the lands, agriculture, and all of these kind of things that judge doesn't want to, property, and all of these kind of things that judge don't want to. So my question to you, Professor Pillay, is in regards to South Africa and India as well. If you see these kind of things that in other countries that you see judges feel more comfortable not only to decide or get a case that is more connected with individual rights that doesn't impact the whole society than social and economic rights, when you have to decide in regards to politics of health and all of these kind of things as well. And Professor Eva, in regards to inequality and all of the things that you were speaking about, do you think that I'm going to my human rights? It is the let's say the right way for us to combat inequality? I'm saying that because, for example, Professor Samuel Moyn, I don't know if you know him, he doesn't believe that human rights, it is the proper way for you to go against inequality. And he doesn't believe that liberal democracy, we have to find a new kind of aspect of democracy or a new kind of content, but he doesn't believe that liberal democracy as we see right now, it is the right way for you to go in regards to problems with welfare state or inequality, social and economic rights. He doesn't believe that human rights, it is the right way for us to go with it. So my two questions is in regards of human rights and inequality, and Professor Pillay, if you could answer that as well, if you believe that human rights, as you are a professor of human rights, believe that human rights has the tools to at least do something against inequality in all of these kind of things. Thank you.
I'll come in quickly, Eva, and then I'll hand over to you. Marina, you ask hard questions. I said that your last question about the value of human rights is one that I set every year in some version for my exams, just to see what people think. You know, it's difficult being, I'm not a human rights skeptic in the sense that Moyne is, I don't think, you know. So I do think there's a value to human rights. I think if you ask people working in organizations, it's not something they really question, right? I think the difficulty has been allowing human rights to dominate the field. So that I think is wrong. I don't think it is, or unhelpful and ineffective, you know. And then connected with that, your point about how courts use economic and social rights. I think it is a bit different in South Africa and India because there is a longer history of dealing with those rights. And so I wouldn't say that judges are not comfortable dealing with them. In South Africa, the constitution itself says that judges should treat them differently, though, because of those qualifications. So they don't treat them as they would civil and political rights. And the approach has been cautious and incremental. You know, but I think there are good reasons for that. The access to justice point is a more significant one. It's a big problem in South Africa. Courts are elitist institutions. Not everybody has the wherewithal to be able to bring a case, but fears that, you know, that the economic and social rights were just going to be used by rich people to get access to test case drugs and that kind of thing. That hasn't happened in South Africa. The cases have been grassroots cases, but partly that's because of the organizations that are bringing them being quite selective and strategic. And I think that's what you have to do. You have to think about how you use litigation and where its value really lies. I mean, oh, sorry, just the question about social groups, excluded social groups, and whether it's the political process or courts that deal better with that. I mean, it's complicated in South Africa because we're coming out of Jacob Zuma's presidency, and you know, a lot of people would argue that the current president is trying to undo a lot of the stuff that happened then, while still fighting some quite powerful forces within the party. So I think a lot in South Africa depends on what happens to the dominant party now, you know, and that is on the political level. There's a lot of xenophobic violence in South Africa. In some ways, foreign people coming from other African countries are the most marginalized people in South Africa at the moment. I'm sorry, that's not really an answer to your question. I don't think it's one or the other, you know, that deal with that issue more effectively. I don't think the political process is dealing with those sorts of groups very well. But equally, there have been cases before the courts, but that in itself is not dealing with the problem either. And I'll stop there.
I just dive in. Right, thank you, Guillaume. Yes, so this is just to go back to one of my slides, and I agree with Anashri. It's not one or the other. One of the reasons is the aspect of time, right, and politics. So groups that are vulnerable may get short-term attention in a democratic system or you know, through politics. Where the legal system can really grip is a more long-term solution, if that is so. And I think that's where, sort of, at least in political science, we see one of the big roles of an independent judiciary. The good thing being is that they're not tied particularly to short-term electoral considerations. So, you know, it's very easy for politicians to make all these promises, but there has to be a long-term take-up of the problem. And I think, however, the more politicized the justice system gets, the less that is likely. So in other words, you need independence, and also you need a sense of long-termism, which is not much valued in democracies. Maybe that's something to go back to, you know. So I just do want to say something on, I know I wasn't asked that directly, but I have some views on this. I'll jump in there on inequality and rights, and sorry, it was on some of these problems of inequality. So forgive me for going back to political theory, but that's really my home turf, so I'm going to answer from that. most of these discourses actually really come from European Christian discourses, right? So often in the Indian case, they kind of jar a little bit. So one of the key components of medieval Christianity that has shaped our thinking about what we have has been the right of property, which in India, by the way, is not a fundamental right. But property has become so ingrained in our thinking of wealth and resources that we can't think of a world without it, but it was highly contested in the 13th, 14th centuries in Europe. And so the idea that human beings have a natural right to property, including to self-ownership on which human rights rest, was very contested at certain points. So I think it's important not to naturalize this discussion too much and see it as a political argument about whether or not we have ownership over us. And that is not necessarily the case, for instance, in most Indian thinking, traditional thinking would not, even modern thinking, really go with that. And whether in fact we have a right to own, say, resources, or whether, as medieval Christian arguments were, we only have a right to use them, or as Locke says, use them without, spoiling. So, there are many provisions, and I think even European thinking is very contested on this. So when it comes to, so we need to reimagine rights, I think, along the ideas of these need to be constantly contested and reassessed. We will not have an argument, because we didn't have them in Europe. So with human rights, I think, Marina, I'm not a human rights expert at all. I mean, not even close, but I do, I teach sort of the idea of natural rights and human rights to students. But so what is, of course, very clear is that, and this brings me back to this contested idea, is that it's become a little bit like the focus on CO2 in the climate debates. It's pushed out methane and all kinds of other poisons. We're focusing only on carbon dioxide, and to the detriment of other, social, environmental ills and other chemicals in the air. So it's a bit like that, albeit in a more negative, in a positive way. Now, the Indian case is quite interesting, or the discussions on rights, especially during when the constitution was formed. Because, as I said, the notion of rights and duties being together is something that one might want to think about in terms of reimagining human rights, that they cannot be separated. But that's quite possibly a conservative way of looking at it. And also, the founding fathers of the Indian polity as secular state were very clear that rights. They rejected the idea that people were inhabited rights, as it were, and they were not inherent to us, but they needed to be exercised to be called a right. So the exercise of something like making a demand in itself becomes a right, rather than actually you in having it. But of course, British utilitarianism is full of this, right? The utilitarians in Britain said, Jeremy Bentham said, rights are nonsense and stilts, and that's because there isn't kind of some empirical idea that we have of rights. And I think that's something quite valuable in both the Indian and the British context to compare with. I have to say that Indian thinking was also influenced by British utilitarianism, but the idea that we need to renegotiate what these rights mean constantly and in dialogue and in contestation, I think. I'll stop here because I'm not.
I think Murilo.
Oi, travou para mim, eu caí, todo mundo caiu junto ou não?
Não.
Terminou? Como é que ficou?
Terminou. So she answered your question. It was the internet. So.
Oh, sorry. Eva and Pillay is still here, right?
Yes, they are.
Oh, so for my technical problem, my internet have just stopped to working, and I am now using my mobile to come back to the meeting. I just would like to thank you again for accepting the invitation for this lecture at UNESCO, And I expect that we could have other opportunities to talk about democracy and welfare state in India, South Africa, in Brazil. Many thanks for you, Eva, Pillay, Marina, to help us to arrange this lecture, and for all the students that still until now participate in this event. Many thanks and have a nice day.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Yes, thank you, Murilo. Thank you, Marina. Very nice to see you
I
again.
hope to see you soon here in Brazil.
And lovely to see the students who I could see on the screen. And nice to meet Anashri as well.
You too. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye. Have a good afternoon.
Bye-bye.